Welcome to COP 2220. Today we're going to do some more things with functions. So I'm going to log on to portal.eng.fau.edu and I'm going to go here to VMware connection. Now it's important, you must be an FAU student, of course, in order to do this connection. I'm going to log in with my username, put in my password, and I have to make sure that I go here to FAU. So now I'm going to log in, and then I'm going to log into the engineering student desktop. So I'm going to log in here to the engineering student desktop, and once I'm in there, I'm going to connect to Canvas and get the Coffee with Functions program that was started in the last video and launch Visual Studio in order to continue to work on the functions for the Coffee program. All right, so let's just zoom in a little bit more here. Now we'll go to Start, and I can type in Visual Studio. And I'm going to launch Visual Studio, and I'm just going to make sure that I create an empty project, and I'm going to paste the code from Canvas into my empty project. So I'm going to make a new project. Then I'm going to make sure it's a Visual Studio Win32 console application. I'll name this Coffee Functions 2. This is creating the directory. I will make sure it's on my Z drive, which it already is on my Z drive, and say OK. When the application settings come up, I'm going to make sure that I'm creating an empty project and uncheck that and click Finish. Now it's time to add the source code. In order to add the source code, I'm going to need to go to Project and Add New Item. So I go here to Project, Add New Item, and make sure that I name the source code with a .c extension. So this will be Coffee Functions 2.c, and add it. Now I want to get the code that I was already working on, so in order to do that, I'm going to go onto Canvas and get the code that I was already working on by going to canvas.fau.edu, logging in, go to this course, go to the right module, download the code, Coffee Functions 1. And when I'm done with this, of course, Coffee Functions 2 will also be available for you to download. But right now we have to make it first. So download Coffee Functions 1. So Coffee Functions 1 has been opened by my compiler, but this is not the current code that's in my project. So I need to select it and put it into the Coffee Functions 2 code, which is the current code for this project. And then I will just close out of that. So this is Coffee Functions 2. All right, so here we are. This is the coffee program. All this program does is it asks and gets the number of coffee that a user drinks 3 times, calculates the sum and the average, and prints the results. It's a very simple problem, but we're going to break it up into functions. Now in the last video, we already made one function. The first function we made was a function. The name of that function, these are user-defined functions. The name of that function is getInteger. That function has a return type of int, and it takes no arguments in order to do its work. What that means is that in order for the function to do its work, we don't have to give it anything. It does everything all on its own. So what this function does is it declares an integer, asks for an integer, gets that value from the user, and returns it. And we have made, this is the function definition, and we've made 3 function calls to that function. So we've called one function by calling the getInteger function, the second function by calling the getInteger function, and the third cups by calling the getInteger function. The next function we're going to do is we're going to do a function that calculates the sum of three integers. So this is a function that calculates the sum, calculates and returns the sum of three integers. So the big thing to do when you are making functions is to decide what your function does, decide what kind of inputs you need to give to that function, and what it's going to return. So if you calculate the sum of three integers, what kind of return type would that have? If you add three integers together, what kind of result would that be? Well, clearly the result would be an integer. So we're going to have an integer return type. We can call this function calculateSum. Okay, and it says that this function is going to calculate and return the sum of three integers. So in order to calculate the sum of three integers, what do you need to give that function in order to do that work? You need to give that function three integers. So we're going to give it integer 1, integer 2, and integer 3. Now we could name these whatever we want. We could name these argument 1, argument 2, and argument 3, 1, 2, and 3. So I'm just going to name it argument 1 because the first argument is an integer. I'm going to name this one argument 2, and I'm going to name this integer argument 3. Now where did these names come from? These names came from me. They're variable names that I made up. When this function gets called, these variables will get declared and initialize the values that are passed to them. So what does this function do? This function calculates the sum of three integers and returns that result. So how do you calculate the sum and return the result? Well, we have these three integers. The three integers that we have are arg1, arg2, and arg3. So we're going to declare a new variable called sum, and sum is going to store the value of arg1 plus arg2 plus arg3. So we're going to take argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, whatever those values are, say they are 2, 4, and 5, then the sum is going to be 11. Whatever, and each time the calculateSum function gets called, it's going to have a different result because different values will be assigned to the different arguments. And after that has been calculated, you will then return the sum. So what does this function do? What it says, it calculates and returns the sum of three integers. So this is a little unit of work. Yes, it's a very simple unit of work that could be done in one statement. But in order to understand how functions work, we're solving very simple problems. All right? So let's now call this function. Well, the first thing we need to do in order to use this function is we need to put a prototype at the top of our program to indicate that this function is going to be used within our program. So in order to do that, we just put a statement that describes the function. It describes what type of arguments go into the function and what the return type is. And it goes at the top of the program so that our program is then going to know what is used in this program. Now we're going to replace this sum calculation right here with a function call to our calculateSum function. So to call our calculateSum function, just like every other function you do, all function calls have the name of the function, they have parentheses, and a semicolon. Now every function call is going to be called that way. Printf is called that way, and then you put the string inside of the parentheses. GetInteger was called that way, but GetInteger had a return type other than void, so it needed to be in the form of an assignment statement. So once you decide that you're going to call that function, then you need to decide two things. The first thing is, does this function have a return type other than integer? So if you take a look at our function calculateSum, other than void. So if you take a look at our function calculateSum, you can see that it does not have a void return type, but it has an integer return type. That means that after this function is called and has completed all of its work, it's going to have a result which is in the form of an integer. Now, in order to return that, you need to have something here with the function call prepared to capture what's being returned. And that is going to be the variable sum. So calculateSum is going to do its sum calculation, and when it's done doing its sum calculation, it's going to have an integer. And that integer will then be assigned to the sum variable. Now, in order to do the calculateSum, we need to pass it 3 integers. So calculateSum doesn't care what integers you pass it. It doesn't care where you get the integers from. It just cares that in order for it to do its work, you need to give it 3 integers. And we have 3 integers that we would like to use for this: cups 1, cups 2, and cups 3. Now these 3 integers are don't have to be in this particular order at all, but all we know is that when calculateSum gets called, then calculateSum is going to, the first argument to calculateSum must be an integer, the second one must be an integer, and the third one must be an integer. So now that I have implemented my calculateSum function, I'm going to rebuild my code. Hopefully it will build, and then I'm going to run it. So if you look at the output window, 4, 5, and 6, that equals 15, and it is working correctly. The next function we're going to do is we're going to do a function that prints the results onto the screen. So we're going to leave our average calculated like this, and but we are going to do a function that prints the results onto the screen. So this function is going to print the coffee average results onto the screen. So let's call this function printResults. So let's think about this for a minute. If our function is going to print the average and sum, so it's going to print the sum and the results of the average and the sum that were calculated. So in order to do that, if it prints onto the screen, do you think that it's going to need to return anything? Is it going to do some kind of calculation and return an integer or a double? Or is it just going to take some information and print it onto the screen? It's going to just take information and print it onto the screen, so the return type will be void. What that means is that this function doesn't return any type of integer, double, or character. For this class, those are our data types that we use. And our options for function return types are integer, double, or character. Now, if this function wants to print results onto the screen, it's going to print the results of a character, an integer, a double, 2 characters, 2 integers, 2 doubles. What is it going to print the results of? Well, it's going to print the results of the average, and it's going to print the results of the sum. And the average is a double, and the sum, A-V-E-R-A-G-E, and the sum is an integer. So in order for our printResults function to properly print results onto the screen, it needs to have the information that is the average, and it needs to have the information that is the sum. And then inside, we're going to do a printf that says the sum is %d and the average is %.2f. So just because the average is the first argument, it doesn't matter because it's going to match whichever placeholder we put it. We have to make sure that in order here we put first the integer, which is the sum. And just to clarify things, I'm going to change these to be different names. So this is going to be argument 1, and this is going to be argument 2. Now, I didn't do that to confuse you. I just did it to point out that these are just names. These are variable names, and they can be whatever names we want them to be. We just have to make sure that our placeholders, like this placeholder is an integer, And we also have to make sure that when this function gets called, we realize that these two variables will get declared and assigned values as the function is called. So we have our first one is an integer, which is arg2 is an integer. And the second one is a double, which is arg1. So what happens when functions get called is that this print results function will get called. A double will be passed here. This double arg1 will be called and assigned whatever value comes in, and this integer arg2 will get declared and assigned whatever value comes in. It's almost like doing this, saying double. It's almost like declaring and initializing a variable, but you don't have to do it because if you declare and you initialize the variables inside the function, you're doing it twice. And that's the way that functions work. So now we need to put our function prototype at the top so we can use this function. And then we want to make a function call to this function. The function is called printResults. And in place of this right here, we're going to put this into a function call. Now I know it's only one line of code and it doesn't seem realistic to make a function call out of one line of code, but like I said before, we want to make our functions very simple so we can focus on the structure and how to use functions, and later we will make obviously much more complicated functions. Now, just like every other function, every function call has the name of the function, parentheses, and a semicolon. Now, once we do that, we decide what is the return type of print results. Print results return type is a void, so therefore that means that it doesn't need to be in the form of an assignment statement because it's not returning any results. But the print results function does take two arguments. The first argument is a double, and the second argument is an integer. So what we need to do is we need to put in here, our first argument must be a double. Do we have a double that we are prepared to pass to this function? Yes, we have avg. Do we have an integer that we can pass to the function? Yes, we have an integer called sum. Now say for example, the sum was a 15 and the integer was 5. The average, so the sum has a value of 15 and the average has a value of 5. So what would happen is print results would get called. Remember, this is a 5 and this is a 15. It would come in here. arg1 would get declared and assign the value 5. arg2 would get declared and assign the value 15. And then it would print onto the screen and put in the placeholder. Right here would be a 15 and right here would be a 5.00. Now if, for example, after doing all of this work and the average was, and the sum was a 18 and the average was a 6, the next time it got called, the same thing would happen. But this time, this would be a 6. This would get declared and initialized to an 18, and it would change what is printed. So each time, it depends on the data that gets passed to the function, what the function is going to do. So let's try both of those scenarios. So I'm going to build it to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. I'm going to run it. So if the first time I do 4, 6, and 5, then the sum is 15 and the average is 5. I can run it again. And I can put in 6, 4, and 8. So the sum is 18 and the average is 6. And each time it is calling these functions. I do have a video on how to follow what's happening with the functions with a debugger, and that will be coming up soon.